Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to outline the simulation argument. Most of you have probably encountered this before. This is one of those relatively rare cases where an argument from philosophy has managed to capture the attention of a broad audience. The basic idea here is that there are good reasons for believing that we are living in a computer simulation. So here's a story, right? As computer power increases, virtual worlds and simulations are becoming ever more sophisticated. Today, we run simulations of all sorts of things. There are computer simulations of things like predator-prey interactions, of the Earth's climate, of the orbits of planets in the solar system, of neural networks and learning, and so on and so on. Now, our current simulations are very limited and they can only really approximate the behavior of the systems being simulated within specific conditions. But the suggestion is that in the future it might become possible to run accurate simulations of things, and in particular accurate simulations of people, where this simulates everything down to the functioning of their cells up to their behavior and interactions with the environment. So it's a simulation of the person on every level, from cells to organs to behavior, and it sort of simulates them in every context. So it's just an accurate simulation of a person. Well, then the claim is that these simulated beings, call them sims, might literally be intelligent and conscious. Remember, this sim behaves within its simulated world exactly the same way that physical people behave within the physical world. And notice, moreover, that if the sim is conscious, then from the point of view of the sim, everything would seem as if it were a real physical world of physical objects. The simulated person would have an experience that is indistinguishable from your visual experience when you open your eyes and you see two hands there. If it's a good enough simulation, then from within the simulation, there would be no indication that it's a simulation. Okay, so if that is possible, then it raises a skeptical challenge, right? What if we are already living in a simulated world? This is the simulation hypothesis. So the claim is the world is a computer simulation. In philosophy, this has been defended most famously by Nick Bostrom. David Chalmers recently released a nice book on this called Reality Plus. So the simulation hypothesis is often presented as a kind of skeptical hypothesis. The skeptical hypotheses have a long history in philosophy. So, consider the hypothesis that this is all a dream, right? How do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? It seems at least possible that I could have a dream that is, from within, right? It's experientially indistinguishable from waking life. In fact, very often when I have dreams, I don't know that I'm dreaming. And so, maybe like what I'm experiencing right now is a dream. René Descartes famously proposed the hypothesis that all your experiences are being generated by a super powerful evil demon. So how do I know I'm not being deceived right now by an evil demon? And with these sorts of scenarios, we can set up a skeptical argument that goes a bit like this. So take any proposition about the external world, such as I have hands, then you can say, well, if I don't know that not S, I don't know that I have hands. I don't know that not S, therefore I don't know that I have hands. S here refers to some skeptical scenario. So if I don't know I'm not dreaming, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not dreaming, so I don't know I have hands. And this argument is appealing to a kind of underdetermination skepticism. So I have the sensory impression that I have a body to which two hands are attached. But the point is that there are many hypotheses that are equally consistent with this evidence. So yes, one of the hypotheses that is consistent with this evidence is that I have two hands. I have a physical body and there's two hands attached to it. But another hypothesis that's consistent with it is that there's an evil demon which is creating these sensory impressions and deceiving me. If I can't rule out the evil demon hypothesis, I can't legitimately claim to know that I really do have two hands. Now, the simulation hypothesis in itself is just another skeptical hypothesis. And so it might not seem to be of that much interest given that, well, we already have a bunch of skeptical hypotheses on the table. But what's interesting about the simulation argument is that it claims not just that this hypothesis is consistent with our evidence, but that there is in fact like positive reason to believe the simulation hypothesis. So I mean, this is a bit different to something like the evil demon, right? The evil demon is consistent with our evidence, but usually we would think, well, there's no particular reason to believe that there is this evil demon. Similarly, am I dreaming right now? Well, it's consistent with my evidence that this is all a dream, but there's no particular reason to believe it. In the case of the simulation argument, though, the claim is, right, we can give an argument which shows that we actually have good reason to believe that this is in fact a simulation. And so if this is right, we have a much more powerful challenge to our common sense view of the world. So then, this is what the simulation argument is going to try to show. It's going to try to show that there are positive reasons to believe the simulation hypothesis. What does this argument look like? Well, here's the basic idea of the simulation argument as Bostrom states it. Suppose that, as we described earlier, later generations are able to use powerful supercomputers to run simulations of populations. If this is possible, it's likely that they would run many such simulations. Technologies, like once you have a technology, people tend to use it. Technologies tend to proliferate after all. Now suppose that the sims within these simulations are conscious. In that case, the vast majority of conscious minds are simulated. So, just imagine that, in the future, people decide to run what Bostrom calls ancestor simulations. So people in the future decide to run simulations of their previous history, right? And maybe they run like 1,000 of these simulations. Well, now we have, there's one history in the non-simulated world, but then they're running 1,000 simulations. And so the point is there will be far more simulated minds than non-simulated minds. The vast majority of conscious minds would be simulated. In which case, it's likely that you are simulated. The vast majority of beings with experiences like yours are simulated, so you are probably simulated. That's the basic idea. I think probably the best statement of this argument comes from David Chalmers. In his book Reality Plus, he puts the simulation argument like this. So, premise one, if there are no sim blockers, most human-like beings are sims. Premise two, if most human-like beings are sims, we are probably sims. And so we can conclude, if there are no sim blockers, we are probably sims. Okay, so let's start with this first claim, right? If there are no sim blockers, most human-like beings are sims. Human-like beings. So human-like beings are beings that are somewhat like us, right? They have sophisticated mental states. They live in societies, apparently very large universes. They have developed, some technologies and so on. What do we mean by sim blocker, though? Well, a sim blocker is something that would prevent a civilization from running a simulation that contains human-like sims. A sim blocker is something that it would just prevent us from simulating people. Now, Chalmers distinguishes two classes of sim blockers. First of all, it could be that human-like sims are impossible or just highly impractical, or just like impossible in virtue of sort of just the physical law or maybe the metaphysical nature of the universe or something. It's not really within anybody's power to create sims, or at least it's not within anybody's power to create many billions upon billions of them, right? So it could be that creating like billions upon billions of sims is just impossible. Second, it could be that human-like sims are possible, and it's possible to create many billions of them, but very few civilizations ever choose to do so. Or indeed, maybe no civilizations ever choose to do so. So, if there are no sim blockers, if there's nothing in these two classes, then the vast majority of human-like minds will exist within simulations, right? So if sims are possible and civilizations choose to create them, then it's going to be the case the vast majority of human-like minds will be simulated. And then the claim is we should be confident that we're sims. Okay, let's take this first class, that human-like sims are impossible. There is some obstacle to sims in virtue of physical law. So one obvious sim blocker is computer power. The human brain is a remarkably complex object. Perhaps it's not just technologically possible to accurately simulate the brain in the detail that would be required to get human-like sims. And so this might be a worry. It's worth noting, though, that based on our current understanding of brains and computers, there isn't any obvious obstacle here, at least in principle. So Chalmers says that brains perform about 10 quadrillion floating point operations per second. This is a computing speed that's equivalent to a computing speed of about 10 petaflops. Today, there are supercomputers that achieve over 100 petaflops, and using distributed computing, we can get that to over 1,000 petaflops. Or is it petaflops? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I just read this stuff. So anyway, I don't know if those numbers are right. Those are the numbers Chalmers gives. But in terms of raw information processing power, if that's right, then there is no in principle obstacle. And even if those numbers are off, I mean, they're probably not, they're probably not like many orders of magnitude off, right? So it looks like, at least if we're just talking about a single brain, at least in terms of the computing speed and efficiency, like right now there's no obstacle, and computers have only been getting more efficient with time. If computer speed increases by a factor of 10 every decade, then within just a century, a second of computer time would be able to simulate 10 billion brains for 1 second each. Again, these numbers are highly speculative, but the thought is, well, there's nothing in principle to show that computers of the future could not create a simulation of many billions of brains. Bostrom actually suggests that a planetary mass computer could simulate the history of humanity's conscious experiences using less than 1/millionth of its processing power for 1 second. So that would be, I mean, you could run countless numbers of simulations within the blink of an eye. You could run simulations of entire human history within the blink of an eye. The real difficulty then is not just raw computer power. I don't know, maybe building a planetary mass computer is a little bit much. That might be a difficulty. But, at least, okay, it seems like simulations are within the power of computers in principle. The real difficulty is figuring out how the brain works and then, writing the simulation in the right way to capture that. Again, is there any obstacle there in principle? As we learn more, as technology becomes more sophisticated? Doesn't seem like it. And in any case, with all of this said, who knows what the powers are, what powers are available in the non-sim universe? So the laws of our universe make it possible to run simulations. That's enough for the basic simulation argument. Once we grant that simulations are in principle possible, then that opens up the possibility of, okay, well, maybe this is a simulation, and then maybe there's a non-sim universe, so there's a universe with perhaps different laws in which simulations are easier. The non-simulated world may be vastly greater than ours, with different laws that allow for much more efficient computers. Consider, for instance, that we think, I believe, that quantum computing is in some respects more efficient than classical computing. If we were to run a simulation of a purely classical world, then even if there could be conscious beings in that world, the simulations that they could then create would be much more limited because they would be unable to take advantage of quantum mechanical phenomena. Okay, so yeah, I mean, maybe, right, given the powers in the non-sim universe, a simulation would not be, a simulation of this universe would not be such a big deal. A more serious sim blocker is consciousness. Obviously, the simulation argument only goes through if it is, in fact, possible for simulated beings to be conscious. The simulation argument, therefore, requires that consciousness is substrate independent. And this is to say that there are a variety of different substances that could realize conscious states. In human beings, consciousness is realized in brains. That's the standard assumption anyway. So wet gooey matter, carbon-based biological objects composed of neurons. But not just any brain is conscious. So on the standard view, brains are conscious in virtue of the fact that they execute the right sort of computational processes, right? There's like stuff going on inside the brain. It's not just that you have a wet, gooey lump of matter. It's that, there's impulses and interactions between the neurons that are processing information in the right kind of way. So substrate independence claims that any other system that executes the same computations as the brain would also be conscious. Consciousness is a matter of the right kind of information processing, and many systems can, in principle, process information in the same way the brain does, in which case a simulation of the brain would also be conscious, provided it's sufficiently sophisticated. So this is what the simulation argument assumes, but the thing is, for all we know, substrate independence might be false. It might be that consciousness can only be realized by particular kinds of matter. Maybe it requires a biological brain, in which case it would be impossible for a simulated entity to be conscious. Now, currently there is no theory of consciousness that commands widespread consensus. Okay, so some people endorse substrate independence, some people deny it, and there isn't a consensus on which theory is right. But, there are arguments we might give that are suggestive. So Chalmers suggests a thought experiment involving gradual uploading. So here's the idea. You start with an ordinary biological brain that everybody would agree is conscious. And then you start replacing parts of the brain, one cell at a time. So at the beginning, you just create a simple simulation of a single cell. Well, maybe that wouldn't be very simple for us now, but we start off with an accurate simulation of a single cell, and then we connect. So we sort of connect. We're running the simulation on a computer, and then we put very tiny little chips in the brain. We replace a single neuron, put tiny little chips in the brain that receive information from the simulation and then send the information to the neighboring neurons. So there's chips connected up to the neighboring neurons with the simulation of a single cell running on a computer. So that's where we start. Then we simulate a few more cells, and then we replace them, and then we replace a few more, and eventually a quarter of the brain is running as a simulation, and then half, and then finally the whole thing. So by the end of this process, what we're left with is a head which is just empty, but maybe on around where the brain used to be, on the outside, there's some silicon chips or something receiving information from a computer that's running a brain simulation, and then the chips are sending that information to the body. So now we have a fully simulated brain. There's no biological brain left. It's fully simulated. And then, of course, we could extend this simulation a bit further if we could replace parts of the body and the environment until we just have a fully simulated person living in a simulated environment. But the point is, we've simulated the brain. Now, through all of this, the behavior patterns are preserved perfectly because this is, by stipulation, a perfect simulation of the brain. Whatever information the brain is communicating to the body, the simulation communicates the same information. So, when half the brain has been replaced, if we ask the patient, how do you feel? They'll respond in just the way you'd expect an ordinary human being to respond. Similarly, for when the brain is fully replaced, if we ask them, how do you feel? They'll respond in just the same way. From the outside, observing their behavior, there is nothing to indicate that their hardware is so different. Now, this sort of gradual replacement, it's presumably physically possible in principle, probably not feasible in practice. But if this kind of gradual replacement did occur, what would happen to the person's consciousness as these changes are made? Well, it seems there are ultimately only three options. So, what happens to consciousness? First of all, it might be that at some point in the replacement process, consciousness immediately disappears. So we replace a single neuron, and then with that, the lights all go out. Maybe this is around when we've replaced a quarter of the brain. Maybe it's around when we've replaced half the brain. Whatever. But we don't know exactly where it is, right? We don't know where this line is. But there's a line in the sand, and when we cross that line, yeah, consciousness disappears. Now this seems kind of odd, right? There aren't really any other processes in nature that work like that, especially since you know, the rest of the brain and body will continue to function perfectly fine. At least Chalmers says there are no processes that work like this, but I'm not so sure. I mean, there are cases of like, I don't know, phase transitions that involve sudden discontinuous change. Like if you superheat water, then even a slight disturbance can cause it to immediately explode into a gas. But I mean, to be fair, I mean, it does seem odd to think that consciousness would work that way. Note also that if you take this option, then this is going to imply that during a person's growth, from fetus to baby to child, there's a single moment, a second, when consciousness just switches on, right? It all just comes online in a flash. It's a bit odd. It's a slightly odd, consequence. So, second option is that consciousness gradually fades out. Once half the brain is replaced, consciousness is significantly diminished, and then when we get to 70%, it's things are very, very dim indeed. So the consciousness gradually fades away as the replacement process goes on. There's a couple of things that are odd about this. So throughout the replacement process, remember that the patient behaves in a completely normal way, and they claim to be fully conscious. They claim that there's no difference whatsoever in their experiences. So, if they put their hand on a hot stove, they're gonna scream and pull it back and be in pain, and they will say that they feel the pain just as vividly. They will say that they are conscious of the pain. So, on this option, it seems that people can be radically mistaken about their own immediate experiences, right? I can be experiencing a pain where I'm saying that this is one of the most intense pains I've ever felt. I'm screaming, I'm crying, just everything indicates that I am indeed in pain. And I'm saying that, and I really genuinely believe it, but I'm actually just not in pain. And so this will be the case for basically all of their experiences once you get late in the replacement process. Additionally, some people think that there's something odd about the idea of degrees of consciousness in general. So some philosophers have argued that consciousness is discrete. You can't be more or less conscious. Of course, you can be conscious of different things. States of consciousness might be simple or more complex. But the thought is that, well, you're either conscious or you're not. Now, what you're conscious of, again, like right now, my visual field, for instance, is extremely complex, and I might close my eyes and my visual field just becomes, Eigengrau, and it becomes much more simple. And so, that's maybe a simpler state of consciousness, but it's not that I haven't become less conscious. It's just that what I'm conscious of is less complex. So some philosophers have said, it seems implausible to suppose that consciousness itself could be vague. Of course, notice that actually what I've just said there conflicts with our intuition that consciousness does not immediately switch on. This isn't really the place to get into this, but either consciousness switches on immediately, or there can be degrees of consciousness, or everything is conscious. And all of those are kind of surprising. So anyway, that's a tangent. That's a video for another time. Anyway, if we rule out these two options, this leaves us with the third option, which is that consciousness survives. And if consciousness survives the replacement process, then consciousness is substrate independent. And then there can be conscious beings within simulations. And so Chalmers says, we should take this seriously. Now, I mean, look, this argument isn't decisive. We can't rule out options 1 or 2. But it does make... I suppose it's clear that, look, substrate independence has surprising consequences. So substrate independence probably has surprising consequences as well. But the point is none of these theories yet commands consensus. And... we have some reason to take seriously the idea that, no, consciousness really might be possible. It might be possible to have a simulated being that has consciousness. Okay, so these were some of the sim blockers that might show that sims are impossible. The second class of sim blockers is that human-like sims are possible, but few non-sims will create human-like sims. But why would that be? What would prevent human-like sims from non-sims from creating human-like sims? Well, I mean, here's one option. It might well be that the vast majority, maybe all, technological civilizations collapse before they become capable of generating sims. I mean, we can see in our own world that technology it comes with risks. Technology has brought about the conditions for its own destruction. We see that the possibility of nuclear war, of catastrophic climate change, of resource depletion. I mean, even if you're not particularly worried about these in the immediate future, what's it going to look like, 1,000 years, 2,000 years from now? I mean, we've seen even, we've had how long has it been since the Industrial Revolution? I mean, barely 2 centuries. Not even 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution. And look at all of the problems that have mounted. And maybe we're going to solve the problems today, but are we going to be able to solve the problems? Are we just going to be able to continuously solve all of these problems for the next 200 years, the next 2,000 years? So more generally, there's worry that as technology becomes more powerful, greater destructive power becomes easier to access. It's not hard to imagine that in the near future, maybe it would become relatively straightforward for, small groups of terrorists to develop bioweapons or other sorts of destructive technologies. Or consider the recent worries about nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. Perhaps it will be much easier to create a super powerful artificial intelligence than it would be to create sims. And there's no guarantee that artificial intelligence would have priorities that align with ours. So there are reasons to worry about what the future holds, reasons to think that there are global catastrophic risks that we might face in the coming centuries. And maybe this is the fate of all advanced civilizations. Maybe they just burn themselves out more quickly, before they're able to, become capable of running sims. Notice that this would also explain what is otherwise a rather puzzling phenomenon. Why is the universe empty? We assume that life on Earth arose through natural processes, and as far as we can tell, that occurred very, very early in Earth's history. Assuming that life arose here and it arose when the evidence suggests it did, it looks like life arose pretty much as soon as it could. So we might think that there's nothing sort of preventing. It's not difficult for life to arise. And yet, when we look at the universe, we find no signs of advanced extraterrestrial life, no intergalactic civilizations, no indication of anybody else out there. Maybe this is because intelligent life is just extremely rare, or it's extremely difficult for it to arise in the first place. Or maybe intelligent life arises frequently, but there's just for some reason intelligent life tends to destroy itself. That's the pessimistic answer to Fermi's paradox. So this is one possibility. Maybe civilizations just end up collapsing. Perhaps a more optimistic view is that non-sims will develop the capacity to create sims, but they just choose not to do so. Now, I mean, the thing is, it's kind of hard to see why this might be. There are powerful motivations to create sims. We can make important discoveries by running simulations. We already run simulations during the course of scientific investigation, and it is kind of hard to see us choosing not to exploit a technology once we develop it. But there are some concerns about sims. So first of all, there might be moral reasons not to do it. So think about, look, our world is an extremely bad one in many ways. There are wars, genocides, famines, debilitating diseases. Our lives are full of sometimes extreme suffering. Now, suppose that we developed sufficiently powerful technology to run ancestor simulations of populations in the past. Should we do it? Should we run a simulation that includes World War II and the Holocaust, knowing that the simulated beings have minds like ours and suffer just as vividly as we do? I think a lot of people would be quite uncomfortable with that. So this is one consideration. Maybe we can hope that every single non-sim civilization is just, they're moral saints who never run simulations because they're concerned for the welfare of the Sims. Alternatively, non-Sims might judge the creation of Sims to be too risky. I mean, we can already see this with people today who warn about the potential dangers of AI. Any computer capable of running, one of these simulations would be enormously powerful. There might also be a concern about simulated beings becoming sophisticated enough that they somehow escape the confines of the simulation. These are the sorts of concerns. So, perhaps this is what's preventing non-Sims from running Sims. Maybe this is a Sim blocker. So, I mean, here's the thing. So all of these things we've been discussing are Sim blockers. If one or more of these is true of non-Sim populations, then it is very unlikely that most human-like beings are Sims. Obviously, if it turns out that Sims are just impossible, then, well, definitely it's not going to be the case that most human-like beings are Sims. But, I mean, there might be these other Sim blockers, like maybe there's some reason that prevents the creation of Sims. But the thing is that all of these are highly speculative. It's not obvious that there are Sim blockers. It wouldn't be unreasonable, really, to bet against all of the potential Sim blockers we've discussed. So that gives us the first premise then. If there are no Sim blockers, then most human-like beings are Sims, and we can see that it's quite plausible that there are no Sim blockers. Anyway, just a quick advert. If you like my videos, please consider signing up to the Patreon. I upload bonus videos on Patreon, so you can see more of me there. There's a bunch of videos on Patreon where I sort of give further commentary on the topics that I've discussed on my channel. Or if you just want to throw me some cash, I have a PayPal. And, I mean, look, I really, I always have to put this into every video, and it must get very annoying for the people who watch all of my videos. So I am sorry about that, but I have to beg for cash. I'm sorry. This is this is just one of the things that happens when you have one of these YouTube channels. It does take a long time to put these videos together. It's a lot of work, and so if you can support me, I really appreciate that, and it really helps. It makes a difference. It makes it possible for me to spend the time that I do on these videos. The fact that people are giving me the support that they are. So it's not for nothing. I also offer private tutoring. Email if you are interested in that. The email's there. And I have a Discord which you can join if you want to discuss any of these. And if you can't give me money, that's totally fine. I totally understand. But one thing you could do is just, give the video a like and leave a comment. Because any kind of engagement helps. It's something to do with the YouTube algorithm. It all helps. Anything, just bang out a few words and put that on the video. That'll help me as well. Anyway, with that said, let's get back to the simulation argument. So we've looked at premise one. Let's turn to premise two. So this is the premise that if most human-like beings are Sims, then we are probably Sims. Why? Why should we accept that premise? Why accept that if most beings like us are Sims, that we are probably Sims? Well, I suspect that most of you will probably find that premise reasonably intuitive anyway, but it's worth being explicit about the reasoning here. So this premise is going to rest on some sort of indifference principle. The way that Bostrom states it is that we ought to be indifferent between, I quote, between hypotheses about which observer you are when you have no information about which of these observers you are. Okay, so putting this a little bit more formally, let's suppose that I believe that some fraction x of beings with experiences like mine are Sims. Then this indifference principle says that, other things being equal, I should have confidence x that I am a Sim. So if I believe that 10% of beings like me are Sims, then I should have a credence of 10% that I am a Sim. If I believe that 99% of beings like me are Sims, I should have a credence of 99% that I am a Sim. So this little equation here, what this says is the credence that I am a Sim, given that the fraction of Sims equals X, right, that conditional credence should equal X. My credence that I'm a Sim, given that the fraction of beings like me are Sims is X, is X. This is an instance of a more general indifference principle, which we can say, so this is my credence that I have property P, given that the fraction of beings like me, given the fraction of beings like me that have property P is X, is X. So suppose that I believe that some fraction X of beings like me have property P, then other things being equal, I should have a credence of X that I have property P. Assuming, that is, that I have no other evidence that bears on whether or not I have property P. So, like, if the only information I have is that, well, 10% of beings like you have property P, if that's the only information I have, then I should have a credence of 10% that I have property P. But it is important to say, assuming I have no other information, because otherwise this doesn't this doesn't work at all. So. Consider that the proportion of people who are non-philosophers is very high. Well, obviously, I shouldn't conclude from that I'm a non-philosopher because I have further relevant information about myself, such as that I have done a philosophy PhD, that I upload videos about philosophy, that I've taught people philosophy. That information suggests that I am a philosopher, even though I know that the vast majority of people are not philosophers. But anyway, right, so assuming that we have no further information, right, this is what this principle says. It's worth noting, just as a side note, that this is, Bostrom says that this is different from an indifference principle, which tells us to assign equal credence to competing hypotheses when I lack information about which hypothesis is true. That principle will lead to paradoxes, which is outside the scope of this video to discuss, but see, for example, Bertrand's paradox. Essentially, the problem is that the probability of a hypothesis will depend on how we choose to carve up the space of hypotheses or carve up the space of possibilities. Bostrom claims that his more specific principle concerning observers, concerning which observer you are, doesn't lead to such paradoxes. But in any case, even if there are specific contexts in which this kind of indifference principle leads to paradoxes, I suppose the argument would be that this particular application of it seems right. Like, when it comes to this point about simulations, once we recognize that, say, 99% of beings like us are simulated, then it seems reasonable to conclude, okay, well, we're probably simulated. So Bostrom gives the following example of applying this principle in a different case. Suppose it's discovered that, say, 10% of the population have a particular sequence of junk DNA. This DNA sequence does not have any noticeable effects beyond what we find when we do DNA sequencing. And there's no correlation that's been found between this DNA sequence and any observable property. So it seems to be randomly distributed within the population. Now suppose that you have not had your DNA sequenced. You have no further information that bears on whether you have this DNA sequence. What should your credence be in the hypothesis that you have that DNA sequence? Well, surely it should be 10%. If 10% of people have it, and there's just no other there's no other information you have that would indicate whether you have it, well, you should have a credence of 10% that you have it. If 50% of people have it, you should have a credence of 50% that you have it. If 99% of people have it, you should be very confident that you have it. Here's another case that comes from Adam Elgar. So let's say that Dr. Evil has built a bomb at his moon base and he's planning to destroy important cities on the Earth. But then he receives a message from the Philosophy Defense Force. They inform him that they have created an exact duplicate of him who has exactly the same subjective experiences as he does. So as Dr. Evil is reading the message that a duplicate has been created, duplicate Dr. Evil is also reading the message that a duplicate has been created. They have exactly the same experiences. And the Philosophy Defense Force says, if you surrender, then duplicate Dr. Evil will be treated very well. However, if you go ahead with this plan of destroying important cities, duplicate Dr. Evil will be tortured. And we assume that the Philosophy Defense Force never lies and that they do indeed have the technology to create these perfect duplicates. And they are perfect duplicates. They have exactly the same subjective experiences, the same perceptions, the same apparent memories. What should Dr. Evil do? Well, by the kind of indifference principle that Bostrom is defending, Dr. Evil should have a credence of 50% that he is the duplicate. So it would be best to surrender, because if he goes ahead and destroys these cities, there's going to be, a 50% chance that he's going to end up tortured. I guess the Philosophy Defense Force could also, maybe they could create like 1 billion duplicates of Dr. Evil, and then Dr. Evil should have very, very, very high confidence that he is actually one of the duplicates. Another way to think about this is with like betting behavior. So suppose that everybody bets in accordance with this indifference principle. Well, then they will bet on being in a simulation, and almost everybody will win, right? If indeed the vast majority of human-like beings are simulated, and then everybody makes a bet about whether or not they're simulated, and they bet in accordance with this principle, almost everybody's going to win. On the other hand, if everybody bets in line with the common sense assumption that they're in a material world with material objects, then almost everybody will lose. The common sense assumption is not a bet that pays off. Again, assuming that the vast majority of beings are indeed simulated. So we should, so that's the defense of premise 2, right? If most human-like beings are sims, then we are probably sims. Now, all of this, of course, as I said, is only other things being equal. This indifference principle is only applicable if there's no other evidence available to you that bears on whether you are in a simulation. So again, as I said, right, like the proportion of people who are non-philosophers is very high. There are vastly more non-philosophers than there are philosophers. So let's say that 99.9% of people are non-philosophers. So my credence that I'm a non-philosopher, given that 99% of people are non-philosophers, should be 99.9%. So I should conclude I'm probably not a philosopher. That's totally absurd because of all this other information I have about myself, which indicates that I am indeed a philosopher. So in order to defend premise 2 of Chalmers' argument, what we need is an argument along these lines. I'm taking this from Brian Weatherson's article, Are You a Sim? So, to defend premise 2 of Chalmers' argument, we need to say something like this. First, a priori, your conditional credence in your being a sim, given that the fraction of beings like you as sims is x, should be x. Second, all of your evidence is probabilistically independent of the property of your being a sim. So, we conclude, your conditional credence in your being a sim, given your total evidence, should be x. In the absence of any information, if I believe that some fraction x of beings like me have property p, then my credence that I have property p should be x. But I might gain further information about myself, which pushes that credence up or down. So, yeah, in the absence of any information, if 99% of beings like me are sims, then my credence that I'm a sim should be 99%. But maybe I gain further information that pushes that credence up or down. The second claim here is ruling that out. It's saying we have no such information that could bear on our credence in our being sims. And it's easy to see why this is, right? Because all of my experiences could be simulated. So, like, let's say I'm looking at a mountain, right? I can't tell from within my own experience whether my visual impression of a mountain is produced by physical light reflecting off a physical object, or whether this process is merely being simulated within a supercomputer. My experience would be the same either way. When I have memories of things, I can't tell whether those memories are, processes going on in a wet, gooey lump of matter, or whether all of that is just being simulated by a computer. All of my experiences could be simulated. So there's no experience I have that could push my credence up or down. Maybe. We might push back here. So here's a difficulty that Brian Weatherson raises. Many philosophers endorse externalist views of justification and knowledge. So I have a video on externalist responses to skepticism that you can go and check out if you want to see more about this. But basically, externalists will deny that a person's evidence supervenes on their conscious experiences. So consider two people, Verity and Verity minus. They both have identical phenomenal states, identical experiences, which seem to be of viewing a mountain, let's say. But Verity is actually looking at a mountain, and Verity minus is merely hallucinating a mountain. Now, on some externalist views, the mountain is literally part of Verity's evidence. Like the fact that Verity is looking at a mountain, that's part of Verity's evidence. So Verity has evidence of an external world that Verity minus does not have. Of course, Verity and Verity minus don't know that they have different evidence, but why assume that everybody knows exactly what their evidence is? The externalists will reject that. So with this in mind, let's suppose that I'm not a sim. Well then, given my evidence, I should be confident that I'm not a sim, even if I know that the majority of beings like me are sims. Now, of course, a perfect simulation of me would reason the same way and come to the same conclusion, but I have evidence that they don't have. Right? My reasoning is based on better evidence. I gain this evidence every time I interact with anything in the world. Now, again, granted, I can't know that I have this special evidence. Nothing in my experience indicates that I have this special evidence, but I have it all the same. And so it is reasonable for me to conclude that I'm not a sim. Now, I mean, look, I think this is a deeply unsatisfying response. Again, see my video on externalist responses to skepticism for more on this. It's worth making just a quick point here, though. As Chalmers points out, on most externalist views, externalists will grant that perceptual evidence can be defeated by other evidence. So suppose, for instance, that you are looking at a field which appears to contain many sheep. Then you learn that all but one of the sheep in the field is a hologram. Well, even if you are in fact looking at the one real sheep, you shouldn't be confident that you're looking at the one real sheep, because your knowledge that almost all of the sheep are holograms undermines your perceptual evidence. So, once you come to learn that, you should have a much lower credence that you are looking at a real sheep. So similarly, Chalmers says, the knowledge that the vast majority of beings like me are sims, that's other evidence which undermines my perceptual evidence. Even if, I can say that, when I look at a cup, that the cup itself is part of my evidence. Well, the problem is that in terms of what my credence should be, my knowledge that most beings like me are sims undermines that evidence. And this is a strength of the simulation argument, because it's not just that the simulation hypothesis is compatible with our experiences. The thought is, well, there's positive evidence that many beings like us are in simulations. And so even if externalism can work against some of the traditional skeptical arguments, it's not so clear that it works against the simulation argument. But this isn't the only way of pushing back against the claim that we have no evidence that we are not simulated. Maybe there could be sort of internal evidence that we're not simulated. Chalmers points out that there may be nonsim signs. So these are features of our world that indicate that it's not a simulation. And so as we learn about our world, this could push our credence that we are simulated down. It's worth noting that similarly there could be sim signs. There could be features that indicate we are simulated. Suppose the stars rearrange themselves to say the words, "This is a simulation." That would be pretty good evidence for the simulation hypothesis, right? But what evidence could there be that we're not in a simulation? Well, earlier we mentioned that there is a great deal of suffering in our world, and maybe we would hope that non-sims would avoid running simulations that contain massive suffering. So the fact that our world contains all this suffering is a non-sim sign. It's kind of a problem of evil for the simulation hypothesis. Of course, this requires us to assume that the beings that are doing the simulating, the non-sims, are good and care about our welfare. Another suggestion made by Chalmers is the size of the universe. We appear to live in an extremely large universe. Our universe, observable universe, contains at least 2 trillion galaxies, probably all of these, except this one, except a small part of this one, will forever be inaccessible to us. So, there's a lot of stuff out there that seems kind of completely pointless. There's also a great deal of detail at scales below what can be perceived by the human senses. The vast majority of properties in our world are hidden. So our world is extremely large and extremely complex with a great deal of depth. Now, why bother simulating all of this superfluous stuff? What would be the point? I mean, if the non-sims were interested in investigating processes like social development, then surely a smaller simulation would do the job just as well, but it would be far cheaper to run. So we should expect that smaller simulations will be more common than large ones. So the apparent size of our universe is a non-sim sign. It reduces the probability that we are simulated. How compelling is this? Well, I mean, it may be true that if the simulators are interested in investigating social phenomena, then there'd be no need to simulate a massive universe, largely inaccessible to the simulated society. But there are other things that the non-sims might want to simulate. Maybe they want to simulate a universe and look at how frequently life crops up under different conditions. Or maybe they want to simulate a universe to study the large-scale development of the universe, and the emergence of simulated life within that universe is just an accident. So it may be that we are simulated, but that the simulation was not created for us. It wasn't made to study us specifically. And we also have to keep in mind, as we noted when discussing computer power, that if we are simulated, then the powers available in the non-sim universe would perhaps far outstrip our own. For us, obviously, a simulation of a universe the size of ours would be impossible. I mean, even simulating a single galaxy seems an impossible task, given how vast it is by our standards. But who knows what the non-simulated universe is like? From their point of view, our universe might not be particularly large or complex. So even if the size of our universe should shift our credence a little against the simulation hypothesis, the argument might be that it shouldn't shift it too much. So we might instead, reframe the defense of premise 2 like this. A priori, your conditional credence in your being a sim, given that the fraction of beings like you as sims is x, should be x. And you don't yet have any other evidence that significantly changes your credence in your being a sim. So your conditional credence in your being a sim, given your total evidence, should be approximately x. So there we go. That is basically the non-sim argument, right? If there are no sim blockers, most human-like beings are sims, and if most human-like beings are sims, then we are probably sims, and as far as we can tell, there are no sim blockers. So Chalmers states his conclusion as a choice between three options. We should be highly confident that either A, we are sims, or B, human-like sims are impossible, or C, human-like sims are possible, but few human-like non-sims will create them. And I see that I've put C, I put it wrong there, because C should say human-like sims are possible, but few human-like non-sims will create them. Although, of course, there could be simulations within simulations, right? So human-like sims may indeed create human-like sims. But anyway, that's with that clarified. The claim is that we have no grounds for being highly confident of either, B or C. So we have to take the first claim seriously. Chalmers himself says that he has a ballpark credence of about 25% that we are sims. And again, notice the difference between this type of argument and the classic skeptical arguments. In the traditional case of a skeptical argument, we just propose a hypothesis that is consistent with all our evidence. But there need not be any positive reason to believe the hypothesis. So, yeah, it's logically possible that I'm dreaming. It's logically possible that I'm being deceived by an evil demon, but there's no evidence in favor of either of those. By contrast, the simulation argument claims there is reason to believe this hypothesis. There is reason to take it seriously. So, I mean, this is the challenge, right? If you assign a very low credence to the simulation hypothesis, You need to also say that it's very likely that there are sim blockers. But then what might those sim blockers be? Right, that's that. That's the simulation argument. And that is all I'm going to talk about today. So thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.